Hi, my name is Daniel Cotovale. Recently, I defended my doctoral thesis in computational linguistics, and since the beginning of this year, I have been working in cooperation with a researcher at the Humboldt University of Berlin, namely Konstantin Schulz. I think he's online now. We focused on annotated corpora for Latin, making them more useful for both school and research. When it comes to research, we included linguistics, both synchronic and diachronic, history, sociology, and theology. Because of this cooperation, I was invited to talk here today, so I would like to thank Konstantin Schulz for inviting me, and I would also like to thank the Humboldt University of Berlin for fostering this kind of scientific exchange. In parallel to my research with Konstantin Schulz, I am also writing a description of Latin grammar, applying the systemic functional theory of language. So this description might come out next year if you are interested. But enough of advertisement. Today I will be talking about the central point in the systemic functional theory of language, also known as systemic functional linguistics, and that is how we humans construe time. I will do this for one linguistic community in particular, namely that of ancient Latin speakers. But the same approach can be applied to other linguistic communities as well, including our own, namely that of English speakers and that of German speakers. The Latin-speaking community inhabited most of southern Europe and northern Africa in different extents over time, from around 2,500 years ago until around 1,500 years ago. This linguistic community did not die off nor gave up their language, but at some point they noticed that they were not speaking the same language anymore and gave other names to their own dialects. Now we see many young people speaking Romanian, Italian, French, Catalan, Spanish, and Portuguese. This presentation has the title Sounds, Letters, Forms, and Items in Latin Verbs. Obviously, I will be talking about Latin verbs. However, I will be focusing on them not only as wholes, but also as sounds and letters, forms and items, all those things a verb is made of. As for meaning, I will focus on one semantic system in Latin verbs, namely that of tense. Tense or tempus is how we call a particular way of construing time that many linguistic communities adopt. In tense, time is construed as an arrow that comes towards us from a past immemorial, pierces through the current situation, and goes away into a future beyond imagination. The theory of time adopted by any linguistic community is a unified patchwork of how members of that community understand change and propensities for change in their environment. So time is very different from material things and space. Time is not something we can represent directly. If we have an image such as this one, which represents the evolution of mankind over time, time is construed as a cue, and each drawing represents one of our common ancestors at different times. Notice that the full image is not a representation of a situation that we could just run into and watch, but actually a juxtaposition of representations of hominoids doing what they usually did in different situations over time. In this sense, time is different from material things and space. Time needs to be construed. It cannot be directly represented. This presentation is divided into two parts. In the first part, we will describe Latin verbs in form and meaning, and in the second, we will use this description to analyze verbal groups in actual text passages. In the first half of the linguistic description, I will show how to identify alternative parts in a verb in a way that is valid for both speech and writing, and I will explain how each part of the verb is adapted to its context. The strategy I adopt can be adopted by anyone studying any language. In the second half, I will show how these parts can be selected to realize different semantic features in different verbs. How each verb part can realize multiple features in one verb and only a fragment of a feature in another. These basic strategies of description will be useful to anyone who wants to describe how wordings realize meanings and how a wording is expressed when we speak and write, no matter which language they are studying. Then we will move on to applying this linguistic description to text analysis. Background. Representation is no reflection. I'm going to be very honest with you. There are multiple valid ways of describing a language, and I must admit I do not take the simplest route. People who want to take simpler routes have their own reasons, their own goals. But I am interested in perception, I'm interested in meaning, and I'm interested in how we construe our experience, Erlebnis, both through perception and through meaning. If we want a theory that is capable of explaining experiential meaning in a language, I mean that kind of meaning that is social in nature, meaning that we mean to one another like he meant there is fire, and not that other kind of meaning that things mean on their own, like smoke means fire. If we want to describe this kind of meaning, then we need to describe language in terms of what it is used for. We need to describe it structurally, functionally, and systemically. And our theory of language must have adequate descriptive resources for this task, otherwise we will fail. Both perception and meaning belong to what we call semiotic systems, systems of signs. This is less clear in the case of perception though. If I perceive a book such as this one here, I know that my perception of this book stands for the actual book that I am holding, but that my perception of the book is not the book itself. There is a relation of standing for between the perception of the book and the book itself, between look and feel and the book itself. Each person who perceives this book has his or her own private perception of this book. This does not mean that we perceive the book necessarily in different ways, but only that each one of us perceives it individually. As we are describing here, the image of a book is a sign for a book, no matter whether the thing that supports that image is a book or a computer screen. In case of drawings and photos, there is no book in front of us. For instance, you all might have seen this famous painting of a pipe. This is a quite realistic painting of a pipe, with a text underneath saying, "This is not a pipe." This means, don't fool yourselves, you cannot use the support of this image in the same way as you use actual pipes. For you, the current support of this image of a pipe is a digital screen. The image of a pipe is coming from a screen as well as the image of the t-shirt. In such terms, perception belongs as much to a semiotic system as meaning does. In perception, we deal with phenomena which are themselves signs. But then, how is meaning different from perception? And where is meaning? Is it only in our heads? The answer to these questions is underwhelming, but they must be answered right front because you will encounter much literature written by researchers who have goals that are incompatible with that of describing meaning. You will hear about the cognitive structure of a wording, you will hear about the cognitive structure of a scene, you will hear about the deep structure of a sentence, and you will hear about concepts as if they were things inhabiting our heads, as if there were a copy of the world that we somehow store in our minds. But these are workarounds that do not help us understand the actual linguistic phenomena, which can be much better understood looking directly at the signs. Let us start by answering the first question. How is meaning different from perception if both are signs? Let us take this scene of the Roadrunner show. Coyote has put a bowl of seeds on the street and has put a sign telling that these seeds are free. This is a trap. There is no free lunch. In this screenshot, there is an image of the sign and the image of the seed. The viewer is expected to perceive the sign and also to perceive the seed. Notice that this is fiction and that the sign and the seed do not exist, though we perceive them on our screens. This means these images are perceptive signs for fictional things. Now, one of these two fictional things is not only a perceptive sign with a graphic structure, but also a linguistic sign with a semantic structure, and it stands for the perceived seed. The meaning of the sign is the second semiotic layer we build when we know the language. However, the linguistic sign is not seed itself. It stands on its own, and it stands for the seed that can be seen on its own. A linguistic sign differs from a perceptive sign in that it represents other potential phenomena in our perception, but it is perceived as being something other than that which it stands for. The second question is about the location of meaning. Where is meaning after all? Is the meaning of the sign in Roadrunner's head? Is it on the seed, or is it on the sign itself? I claim it is on the sign. We as viewers can only infer what is going on in Roadrunner's head, and though we can see the seed in this case, can we see it in this case? Is there seed in this case? No, there is no free lunch. This is a trap. So can we actually say that the meaning of the sign is on the seed? Not really. The meaning of a sign is always public and it remains in the sign itself. Part 1, Section 1. Representation of sound. Now that we clearly saw the difference between representation and perception, let us move to our first point. What counts as a sound and what counts as a representation of a sound? One way to go about this is to download an IPA chart, the International Phonetic Alphabet, and say that these are the sounds that we humans can produce and that a subset of these sounds is available in a given language. That may be a good way of going about it if one is creating a grapheme to morpheme software and wants to have a first version of the system up and running as soon as possible. However, this is not necessarily the most interesting way to treat speech if we are concerned about how we learn the language of our linguistic community and then how we learn to write in that language. Let us take the sounds in 20 and 27. Here we have 5 graphic representations of the sound in 20. We have an Arabic number, a Roman number, a spelling, a sound waveform, and a sound spectrogram. These are alternative graphic representations of the sound in 20, which are meant for different purposes. The latter 2 are continuous, whereas the first 3 are easier to break down into smaller graphic units. However, as we are going to see, the ways in which we split up the sounds for each composed graphic representation is not that systematic. For the Arabic numbers, the sound 20 is either represented by 2 characters or it is represented by a single one, and 7 is represented by a single character. Notice, however, that the order in which graphic characters are written down is different from the order in which the represented sounds are spoken. A similar correspondence occurs for Roman numbers. However, in Roman numbers, 20 is always represented by the same pair of graphic characters. The spelled out number is different in this regard. It contains 1 letter per sound in the same order. Here we should point out that what counts as a sound in the German writing system may be longer than a sound in IPA. For instance, the letter Z in German corresponds to the letters TS in IPA, and the letter U in German corresponds to the letters glottostop U in IPA. If we cut the sounds of speech based on the way we write it, the letter Z in German corresponds to 1 sound, and the letters TS in IPA correspond to 2 sounds. Nonetheless, the sound of Z in German corresponds to the sounds of TS in IPA. This is not all. Let us take the words Bar and Bär in German. One can write the word Bär both with A and umlaut, or write it with A followed by E. We cannot cut one sound span for A and another for umlaut, and we cannot spot a sound for A and another for E. If we consider a letter a graphic unit that stands for a sound, A with umlaut is a letter, despite the fact that this is a combination of 2 characters, and so is A followed by E. In this sense, A, E, is a single letter standing for a single sound. In other words, what counts as a letter is determined by the sounds of a language, and what counts as a sound is determined by the letters of the language as well, at least partially. There is a way whereby the sound of a letter can be further divided, and that way is achieved by the contrast of forms. In this pair, the sound of X in Latin spelling is equivalent to the sound of C and S. Whenever a graphic character corresponds to 2 or more letters in sound, it is a ligature. Latin had a single ligature, namely X, but it had multiple composed letters, especially for nasal vowels and long consonants. In this sense, Letters and ligatures are combinations of graphic characters that can be mapped to sounds. This is an essential step for describing recognizable forms. For instance, if we describe the forms of verbs with characters instead of letters, we would have to consider the character E in list a grammatical unit added to the stem les of the verb lesen instead of the letter composed of the characters E and E. That would be a terrible description of the German grammar for those who learned it as children, but it would work as well as the other one for the written language if we were building a parser. If we want a description of Latin grammar, or of the grammar of any other language which is applicable to both spoken and written texts, the smallest unit that can count as a recognizable form in grammar must be a letter and a sound in the sense presented here. It cannot be a character that happens to be called a letter by convention. Part 1, Section 2, Representation of Experience. Here is where our journey begins. We are now going to describe the selectable forms in Latin verbs and explain how they are adapted to their contexts. All units of grammar have a form. The form of a grammatical unit is a sequence of strokes or sounds that expresses that unit. All clauses boil down to forms, like words do. The shortest segment of expression that counts as a grammatical unit are the morphemes. These are the building blocks of wordings. A morpheme is atomic, in the sense that the features it carries cannot be distributed among its parts. Let us use a simple example to illustrate morphemes in two Neo-Latin languages, Spanish and Italian. In Spanish, the words pequeño, pequeños, pequeña, pequeñas, which mean small, are composed of two or three morphemes. In Italian, the words piccolo, piccoli, piccola, and piccole, which also mean small, are always composed of two morphemes. In both cases, the endings determine the gender and the quantity of kids who are small. There are two genders, masculine and feminine, and there are two quantities, one or more than one. Here we see a difference between the languages. Whereas in Spanish there is one morpheme for masculine, another for feminine, and another for plural, singular being the feature when the plural is not specified, in Italian there are four morphemes, one for each combination between gender feature and quantity feature. It only makes sense to talk about morphemes when there is more than one word. It is only by contrasting words that we can tell what can be inserted, removed, or replaced, and how semantic features are realized by opposing word parts. If this were all, we could just call the work done and go home. But no, there is a bit more to morphemes than mere concatenation. Let us now take a look at some Latin verbs and see what is going on. Here are a few quite typical Latin verbs, which mean I am sitting, I am standing, and I am lying. In Latin, one can describe a person in some location in these four ways. A Latin speaker may choose not to specify the person's pose, or to specify it. If the pose is specified, these are the three most typical poses for a person. Besides these four options, one must also specify if the person is the speaker, the addressee, or someone else. This renders a total of 12 verbs, with two parts each. One constituent is selected according to the pose, the other constituent according to the person who is in that pose. However, the actual forms are determined not only by the item one chooses for the morpheme, but also by the items chosen for the adjacent morphemes. A form is what we can recognize, but it can also be viewed as an available item in a list. In this sense, different forms are available in different contexts, but the different sets of available forms for different contexts constitute equivalent lists of options. But wait, Latin has hundreds of verbs for the same lexical item. It couldn't ever be the case that one had to memorize which form one picks for each context. It must be simpler than that. And indeed, it is. A form is adapted to its context. It is adapted to its context like an animal is adapted to its environment. This means that we can divide items into strands according to the way they are adapted to the environment. And we can split up the environments into groups according to the adaptive pressures they made. Most items for verbal strands in Latin belong to one of 5 strands: the A strand, the E strand, the E strand, the I strand, and the null strand. In school, we hear about 4 conjugations, but that is not really what happens. There are 5 frequent strands of verbs, and a few less frequent ones. Items of these strands are adapted to their contexts in 5 ways. We have the O adaptation, the S adaptation, the T adaptation, the N adaptation, and the R adaptation. This means that one could memorize a total of 5 forms per strand, 1 for each adaptation. However, even that is too much. Sometimes, an item is molded in the same way for 2 or more adaptations. This means there are less moldings than there are adaptations. Each molding differs from each other in formal features. For R-strand items, there is a short molding and 2 long moldings. One of the long moldings is weak because it has a short vowel, and the other is strong because it has a long vowel. Here you can see the moldings per item strand. The alternative forms per item are quite few after all, and there are only 5 kinds of contexts that one needs to learn for knowing which of the alternative form is available. So far we have split words down into stems and leaves. However, verbs are just a bit more complicated than that. Leaves are often selected according to a person's speech role or gender. They are traditionally called personal endings or adjectival endings, based on whether they agree with a person regarding that person's speech role or that person's gender. These names are not very good. First, it is weird to say that a verb has an adjectival ending. If a morpheme is the last constituent of a verb, it is a verbal ending, not an adjectival ending. Moreover, some verbs represent a natural process, such as that of raining, snowing, and so on. In that case, the leaf is not seamed to a person. In addition, a leaf is not always an ending because it may happen in the middle of the verb. In short, these atomic forms are not adjectival, they are not necessarily personal, and they are not necessarily an ending, so we call them leaves instead. If, for a particular verb, a leaf is seamed to a person, we call it a seam because it seams the verb to that person. But then there is also the rest of the verb. The verb also often represents the tense of the process. For instance, for the item sedere, interactants add a branch for past and one for future. Traditionally, this morpheme is called the tense mode affix, but this is also a bad naming. Seams are rather a system of accordance than a system of agreement, because seams are only present when a leaf is selected according to a feature of a person or a thing, such as their speech role or their gender. One does not need to count on a clause constituent for the verb to agree with it. Seams constitute systems of options. One of these systems is the 6-option Ost system, which has 2 foliages with O leaves and 1 foliage with E leaves. The second one is the 6-option Almus system, which has 5 foliages with R leaves. And the third system is the 4-option Isse system, which has 5 foliages with S leaves. For screen space economy, if we let a single verb represent its set whenever the verb contains a leaf, we can more easily create an overview of the verbs for a particular lexical item. Such an overview looks like this one. Verbs may contain a stem and a leaf, a stem and a branch, or a stem, a branch, and a leaf. In this last case, the order between the branch and the leaf depends on which branch has been selected. Finally, let's color the stems according to their aspects. We can see that the aspect of the stem is essential for determining our positions, especially in verbs without a branch. If we resort the forms according to their aspects, we can notice that the available branches depend on the stem aspect. This is a crucial point for describing tense in Latin. When it comes to tense, there are multiple process types regarding how tense is construed. For each process type, tense is construed by different stem aspects, branches, foliages, and auxiliaries. When it comes to a process in particular, it can be placed on a timeline in different ways, in different modes. There is the injunctive mode of representing tense. That is the way tense is represented in free clauses. Here we also have 4 conjunctive modes. One typical of dependent clauses with ut, another one typical of dependent clauses with si, a third one for clauses reporting locutions and ideas, and a final one for dependent clauses with dum. If we color the tenses, we can better see that injunctive verbs constitute 3 option systems, including a past tense in blue, a present tense in red, and a future tense in green. There are also 2 option systems, including a past tense opposing a non-past tense. This opposition is also known as an opposition between a perfect aspect and an imperfect aspect. Finally, there are verbs that are tenseless, because they may represent a past, present, or future process. In addition to the unmarked injunctive past verbs, there are also the marked ones. For past process, one can select verbs that represent regular or stunning events, and which specify the person who is in awe, either the narrator or the witness. There are also secondary tenses, where a process is said to be past, present, or future during a past event. Again, each secondary tense may be represented in different conjunctive modes. With this, we separate tense and mode as 2 semantic features of the verb, which are realized by stem aspect, branch, foliage, and auxiliaries. This is all I have to say about tense and mode for the moment. We will come back to this linguistic description and compare it to the traditional tense mode system at the end of the presentation. But for the moment, this is all. Part 2. Analyzing a recount of past events. Now let's analyze some texts and see how tense is construed in practice. But before we start, let us set up the context. This is the Battle of Cannae. It took place in 216 BCE. This battle is infamous because many Roman soldiers died as a result of it. And this is Titus Livius, or simply Livy. He lived from 59 BCE to 70 CE, and he wrote about the history of Rome, including the Battle of Cannae, which took place more than 150 years before he was born. There are a few concepts that we need to know before reading the text. First, we need to know the 2 sides in the war. Romans and Carthagers were fighting for the second time. There were 3 fronts in the battle, and we will talk about one at Cannae, a village somewhat near Rome. We will also need to know where the Alia is. In addition, we need to know that each army camp had a back door. If the camp was stationed somewhere for a long time, the back door ended up looking like this one at Weissenburg in Bavaria. Finally, every army camp was surrounded by markets, with settlers selling all sorts of things a soldier might need, such as marching boots and specialties. Settlers don't exist anymore in modern armies because we have better supply chains. Now let's move on to the text. We will read 5 passages in total and check how tense is being construed in each one of them. Let me read the first passage. I'll read only the translation to English. Here it is. This is the story of the Battle of Cannae, as infamous as the calamity of the Alia, quite lighter than what happened after the battle, because the battle was cancelled off by the enemy, and equally heavier and uglier given the damage to the army. The flight to the Alia exposed the city as much as it helped the army. Barely 50 men followed the consul who fled to Cannae, while the whole army stayed by the other one who died. In this opening passage about the battle, Livy has used 3 verb inflections for processes. That the processes taking place in the battle were past at the time of interaction, this is obvious. The question that remains is why each process was represented in that way they were represented. From now on, I will take some clues found by another researcher called Simon Ayert. A typical way of placing a going-on on a timeline is by placing it relative to the time of interaction. This is what we call primary tense. In red, this text, being the story of the Battle of Cannae, takes place during the writing by Livy and also during the reading by us. In blue, all processes take place before the writing. In yellow, we have processes that take place at the time of the story, but this placement on the timeline is not specified by the verb. Notice how brilliant this is. Each process is placed before or during the storytelling by their own verbs. There is a verb for past processes, another for present processes, and yet another for processes irrespectively of when they take place. We shall see that this is the case for all verbs. In Livy's text, to determine which verbal group Livy had to pick, we only need to account for primary tense, like we did here, for secondary tense, for conjunctive modes, and for interpersonal modes regarding whether someone is in awe with what took place and who that person is. Now let us proceed with the actual story. So it reads: At that time, our cavalry and the light-armed infantry, which was assigned to them, got pushed back by the enemy's first onslaught, as I mentioned earlier, and when they were returning to the camp, they ran back at the enemy and again fled to another place. Let us take the 3 first processes that took place. The first process is a state that was present in a past event, fuerant. Notice that the traditional name for this tense is past perfect, but that name does not correspond to the actual meaning in this case. This is one way, one mode of representing past in past. The next verb is pulsos, a way of representing a past event when the past event is mentioned as something that the narrator has said before. The last verb of this triad is reciperant, were returning, an event that was present in the past event that shall come next. Notice that this is yet another mode of representing present in past, one that is used with the conjunction cum. The last 2 verbs represent processes of running and fleeing, processes of escaping. These verbs not only represent such processes, but also give them the interpersonal status of awful. Occurrebat represents the process of running into someone, in this case the enemy, and the survivors who lived out this trauma reported what happened in awe. The same can be said of the verb petebant. In turn, Livy reported on these events, ascribing them the status of awful for the witnesses, not necessarily for him, the narrator, a man born more than a century after the wars were over. This means that there are 3 ways of representing past events in 3 clauses in Latin, 3 interpersonal modes of representing the past tense, indicating whether someone is in awe and who that person is. Let us now move to the third passage. This is the first half of a clause complex. It reads like this: Settlers too were seeing that our soldiers had crossed the river from the back gate to the hillside, so they came out of their tents to loot. Here we find three verbs that construe tense. The first is transise, and it represents an event that is past in another process, which can be past, present, or future. Here only the secondary tense, the relative tense, is specified. The second verb, conspexerat, were seeing, represents the related event. That event is present in another past event. The past event this one is related to is represented by egressi, came out. Such verbs are usually called nominative absolute, but here we are treating them as yet another way to represent a past event. A way to represent a past event that is followed by another past event. In that sense, this mode of representing past events include both what is usually called nominative absolute, but also what is called ablative absolute. The actual ending, whether it is or e, o or us, is determined by the verb transitivity, and also by the type of process, whether it is like loquor or like dico. Moving on, we have the second part of the passage. It goes like this: but when they looked through the back gate and saw that the enemy was walking about in our camp, these sneaks ran away. Here the verb respexissent, looked, represents a process that is past in a past event. The verb versari represents a process that is present in another event no matter when. The verb vidissent, saw, represents a process that is also past in a past event, like respexissent, the first verb. Finally, the last verb is mandabant, and it represents a process of escaping. Like in the previous passage, Livy reports this process as something awful for the witnesses, not just another process in the flow of events. Now we turn to the final passage that we shall analyze. It reads like this: in the meantime, there arose a quarrel and a sword fight between those who were coming with the baggage, and each man went a different way, fearing for his life. This passage has an embedded clause which defines the people taking part in the fight. The verb veniebant, were coming, represents a present event in the other events outside the embedded clause. The other two verbs oriebatur and ferebatur represent actions of fighting and escaping, and both of these actions are given the status of awful for the witnesses. Witnesses were in awe. They were shocked with what was going on. This text analysis illustrates what can be achieved with a systemic functional description of Latin verbs. As you have seen, we were able to determine whether processes were present or past, whether they were present or past in a past event, and whether they were present or past in another event that could take place at any time. In particular, when we say present, past, or future in a systemic functional analysis of a text, we truly mean that the process is present, past, or future. This is in stark contrast with what is done traditionally. In a traditional description of Latin verbs, the features of tense and mode are neither the tense of the process nor a mode of representing them. These features are meant as indices to the morphemes of a verb, and once the morphemes are identified by sufficient features, one gives one of multiple interpretations for those morphemes. What I am proposing here is quite different. We identify items and aspects by giving them proper names, and we organize the verbs or verbal groups according to the semantic features that get realized by the morphemes. In this way, we get a simple and direct naming convention for the verb parts, and a very clear network of semantic options that Livy or any other historian used for writing his or her own texts. For synchronic linguistics, this enables us to precisely determine the tense of a process when we see a verbal group, and it enables us to determine the verbal group for any process tense. If we want to get fancy, We could improve our corpus search engines drastically with such a model, because we would be able to search for events in a chronological order. For diachronic linguistics, the benefit of a systemic model is even more drastic. We can track not only how verbal groups stop being used or get created, we can also track how options in meaning become fashionable or are forgotten, and how a verbal group progressively shifts meaning, either by acquiring new ones or by being substituted by other verbal groups for one or more of its meanings. So this is it. This is the fractal approach to tense construal that I wanted to share with you. I hope it was insightful and allowed you to see meaningful patterns in Latin that you would otherwise not see. I would like to close this session by thanking again Konstantin Schulz and the Humboldt University of Berlin for the opportunity of presenting this lecture. I will be available for questions and I would love to know your feedback. Thank you.